Nobody imagined that the woman they called Barren would become the mother to more children than anyone in the Arctic village. This is a story of Elena Morrison, whose empty arms would one day embrace more love than she ever thought possible. Elena Morrison stood at the window of her small cabin, watching her husband Thomas pack his belongings into leather saddlebags. 7 years of marriage had passed like the harsh Arctic winters, cold, endless, and barren. The village woman whispered behind cupped hands whenever she walked by. "Still no children," they would murmur. What kind of woman cannot give her husband an heir? The frost on the window pane created intricate patterns that reminded Elena of the delicate lacework her grandmother had once taught her to make. But unlike those careful stitches that had created something beautiful, Elena's 7 years of trying had produced nothing but disappointment and growing silence between her and Thomas. Each month that passed without the blessing of a child had added another layer of ice to the relationship, until now they moved around each other like strangers sharing temporary shelter. Thomas barely looked at her as he secured the last of his possessions to his horse. His jaw was set in the same hard line that had become familiar over the past months. The silence between them had grown thicker than the morning frost that covered their windowsills. She remembered when that same jaw had been soft with tenderness, when he would cup her face in his calloused hands and promise her that their time would come, that God would bless them when the moment was right. The leather creaked as Thomas adjusted the straps on his saddlebags. Each sound felt like another nail being driven into the coffin of their marriage. Elena watched his movements with detached fascination of someone witnessing a disaster they were powerless to prevent. His hands, which had once been gentle on her skin, now handled his possessions with the same efficiency he used when butchering livestock, necessary, methodical, and devoid of emotion. "Where will you go?" Elena finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The words seemed to hang in the cold air between them, visible as small puffs of vapor that dissipated as quickly as her hopes had. Thomas paused, his hand resting on the saddle horn. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of the man who had once promised to love her through all seasons. The man who had built this cabin with his own hands, planning for the children they would fill it with. The man who had planted apple trees behind the house because he wanted their sons and daughters to have fresh fruit in the summers. But the flicker vanished as quickly as breath in the cold air, replaced by the stranger he had become over these past months of growing desperation. "To the settlements down south," he said without turning around. "I need a wife who can give me sons, children to carry on my name." His voice carried the flat finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. There was no anger in it, no passion, just the cold logic of a man who had made a business decision. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She had known this moment was coming, had felt it approaching, like a distant storm on the horizon. Still, hearing it spoken aloud made her legs weak beneath her. She gripped the windowsill for support, her knuckles turning white against the rough wood that Thomas had sanded smooth with such care when they were newlyweds. 7 years, Thomas," she whispered. 7 years we've been trying. The village medicine woman said, "The village medicine woman is a fraud," Thomas cut her off harshly, his voice carrying a bitterness that made Elena flinch. "I've wasted enough time on false hopes and empty promises. Sarah Whitmore lost her husband last month, and she already has 3 healthy boys. I'll be taking her as my wife." Elena's hand instinctively moved to her stomach, to the place where life had never taken root despite countless nights of desperate prayer, despite the bitter teas the medicine woman had prescribed, despite the pilgrimages to the small chapel where she had worn out her knees begging God for the blessing of motherhood. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. Sarah's husband had died in a hunting accident, leaving her with 3 children and no way to provide for them. Thomas would gain ready-made sons, and Sarah would gain security. Everyone would benefit from this arrangement except Elena. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of wind rattling the cabin walls and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Elena found herself memorizing these sounds, knowing that soon she would have only silence for company. The hawk's cry reminded her of summer days when she and Thomas had worked together in their small garden, when hope still lived in her heart and the future had seemed full of possibilities. What would you have done if your partner abandoned you after years of trying for children together? Would you fight for their relationship or accept that some bonds are too broken to repair? The cabin belongs to you, Thomas said, mounting his horse with the same decisive movements she had watched him use 1,000 times before. I've left enough supplies to last through winter. After that, he shrugged, the gesture somehow more cruel than any words could have been. The shrug said everything he couldn't, or wouldn't, say aloud. After winter, she would be entirely on her own, cut adrift in a world that had little patience or provision for women without husbands or children. Elena watched him right away, his figure growing smaller against the vast white landscape until he disappeared entirely behind a stand of pine trees. Only then did she allow herself to cry, her tears freezing on her cheeks before they could fall to the ground. The salt stung her skin, but she welcomed the pain. It was the only thing that felt real in a moment that seemed like a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. She stood at that window long after Thomas had vanished from sight, watching the empty landscape and trying to imagine what her life would look like now. The supplies he had left would indeed last through winter, but what then? She had no family to return to, no skills that would make her valuable as anything other than a wife and mother, role she had apparently failed at so completely that her own husband had discarded her like a broken tool. The village would pity her at first, she knew. The women would bring casseroles and speak in hushed tones about the tragedy of it all. But pity had a short lifespan in a place where survival required every person to contribute something valuable. Eventually, she would become just another cautionary tale, a reminder to young wives of what happened when they failed to fulfill their primary purpose. 3 weeks passed in bitter solitude. Elena survived on dried meat, preserved vegetables, and the stubborn determination that had carried her through 7 years of disappointment. The village women no longer whispered about her, they simply pretended she didn't exist. She had become a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened to women who failed in their most basic duty. The days blended into each other with the monotonous rhythm of survival. Elena chopped wood until her hands bled, hauled water until her back ached, and maintained the cabin with the desperate energy of someone who had nothing else to focus on. Physical exhaustion, she discovered, was an effective antidote to emotional pain. When her body was too tired to function, her mind had no energy left for the endless cycle of self-recrimination and regret. She had stopped going to the village entirely after the first week, when she'd overheard Mrs. Patterson telling her daughter, "That's what happens when a woman thinks too highly of herself to accept God's will. Pride goeth before the fall, and Elena Morrison's pride has fallen mighty far." The words had cut deeper than Thomas's abandonment, because they contained just enough truth to make her wonder if her suffering was indeed punishment for some failing she couldn't identify. The cabin felt enormous without Thomas's presence. Every room echoed with memories of their early years together, when they had planned for the children who would fill these spaces. The spare bedroom they had prepared as a nursery had become a shrine to their failures. A crib Thomas had carved with his own hands, a rocking chair Elena had cushioned with fabric featuring tiny yellow ducks, shelves lined with books of fairy tales and children's stories she had collected one by one, imagining the day she would read them to sleepy little ones. It was during a particularly brutal snowstorm that Elena first heard the crying. At first, she thought it was the wind howling through the gaps in her cabin walls, a sound she had grown accustomed to during her weeks of isolation. But something about this sound made her pause in her mending, needle suspended halfway through a torn seam in one of Thomas's old shirts that she hadn't been able to bring herself to burn or give away. There it was again, definitely human and definitely young. The sound cut through the howling wind with the unmistakable quality of distress that every adult recognizes, no matter how hardened their heart might have become.
Elena set down her mending and moved closer to the window, pressing her ear against the cold glass and straining to hear over the storm. The crying came in waves, sometimes nearly lost beneath the wind, sometimes rising clear and desperate above the natural sounds of the blizzard. It was the kind of crying that spoke of exhaustion, of fear so deep it had worn itself raw, of children who had cried until they had no strength left but couldn't stop because stopping meant surrendering to despair. Elena wrapped her heaviest coat around her shoulders and stepped out into the blinding white chaos of the storm. The wind immediately tried to push her back inside, grabbing at her coat with icy fingers and filling her eyes with stinging snow. But she pressed forward, following the sound that tugged at something deep in her chest, something that had been dormant for so long she had forgotten it existed. The snow was deeper than she had realized, reaching nearly to her knees and making each step a monumental effort. Her boots disappeared completely with each footfall, and she had to use her hands to steady herself against the wind that seemed determined to knock her down. The crying grew louder as she moved away from the cabin, and she realized with growing alarm that it was coming from multiple sources, not one child, but several. 50 yards from her cabin, she found them. 3 children huddled together beneath the makeshift shelter of pine branches and animal skins that provided little protection against the ferocious storm. The oldest couldn't have been more than 8, a girl with dark hair matted against her skull and lips blue from cold. She was clutching 2 smaller children, a boy and another girl, both of whom looked barely old enough to walk. The sight hit Elena like a physical blow. These weren't village children who had wandered too far from home. Their clothes were wrong, their skin darker, their features carrying the stamp of people who had traveled far to reach this place. They were strangers, refugees from some disaster she couldn't imagine, and they were dying in the snow not 50 yards from her warm cabin while she sat inside feeling sorry for herself. "Help us," their older girl whispered when she saw Elena. Her voice was barely audible over the wind, but the words carried a desperation that cut straight through Elena's heart. "Please, our parents, the sickness took them. We've been walking for days." Elena didn't hesitate. She scooped up the smallest child, a little girl who felt as light as a bird in her arms, while helping the other 2 to their feet.
"Come," she said firmly, raising her voice to be heard over the storm. "You're safe now." The journey back to the cabin felt like miles, though Elena knew it was only a few dozen yards. The children could barely walk, leaning heavily against her as she guided them through the deep snow. The smallest one, little more than a toddler, had lost consciousness entirely, her tiny body limp and frighteningly cold in Elena's arms. Back in her warm cabin, Elena worked with the efficiency of someone who had found her true purpose. She heated water, prepared warm broth, and wrapped the children in every blanket she owned. Her movements were quick and sure, guided by instinct she hadn't known she possessed. As she tended to their frostbitten fingers and toes, carefully warming their extremities and checking for signs of serious injury, she learned their names. Mary was a brave 8-year-old who had kept her siblings alive through sheer will and determination. Her dark eyes held intelligence beyond her years, along with a kind of weariness that came from carrying responsibilities no child should have to bear. She answered Elena's questions in a voice hoarse from crying and exposure, explaining in broken sentences how their parents had died of fever, how the other families in their traveling group had gradually abandoned them as supplies ran low and winter deepened. Little James was 4 years old, with enormous brown eyes that watched everything with the hyper-vigilant attention of a child who had learned not to trust the world. He sucked his thumb constantly and flinched whenever anyone moved too quickly. But he stayed close to his sisters with the fierce loyalty of a pack animal, protecting his family. And tiny Sarah, barely 3 years old, had not spoken a single word since Elena brought them inside. She accepted food and warmth and clean clothes with the passive compliance of someone who had learned that resistance was futile. But her eyes tracked Elena's every movement with an intensity that was both heartbreaking and unnerving. "What will happen to us?" Mary asked, as Elena brushed the tangles from her hair with gentle strokes, working carefully around the small cuts and scrapes that marked their journey. "The other villages, they said they had no room for orphans." Elena's hands stilled. She had been so focused on the immediate crisis, warming them, feeding them, making sure they survived the night, that she hadn't allowed herself to think beyond those basic needs. But Mary's question forced her to confront the reality of the situation. These were orphaned children with nowhere to go, no family to claim them, no resources to sustain themselves. In a world where every family struggled to provide for their own, 3 more mouths to feed represented an impossible burden. She thought of her empty cabin, of the supplies Thomas had left behind, of the long winter stretching ahead with no one but herself to worry about. She thought of the nursery upstairs, still decorated for the children she had never been able to conceive. She thought of the crushing loneliness that had been her constant companion since Thomas's departure, and the way her heart had come alive again the moment she had seen these children in need. "You'll stay here," Elena heard herself say, the words coming from some deep place she hadn't known existed, "with me, for as long as you need." Mary's eyes widened with something Elena recognized as hope, tentative and fragile, as if the girl had been hurt too many times to trust easily, but desperate enough to want to believe. "Really?" she whispered. "You won't send us away when the storm ends?" Elena looked at the 3 children, Mary with her grave responsibility and hidden vulnerability, James with his watchful eyes and need for security, tiny Sarah with her silence that spoke volumes about whatever trauma had stolen her voice. They were nothing like the babies she had dreamed of, nothing like the children she had imagined rocking to sleep in that carefully prepared nursery upstairs. But they were here. They were hers for the taking, and something in her chest that had been cold and empty for months was suddenly warm and full. "I won't send you away," she promised, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The next 2 months transformed Elena's cabin from a shrine to her failures into something entirely different, a home filled with laughter, arguments, bedtime stories, and the constant wonderful chaos that comes with children. The change was so complete and so rapid that Elena sometimes felt as if she had stepped into someone else's life, someone who had always been a mother instead of someone who had failed so spectacularly at becoming one. Mary proved to be mature beyond her years, helping Elena with cooking and mending while fiercely protecting her younger siblings from any perceived threat. She had appointed herself the family's unofficial guardian, always positioning herself between her siblings and any potential danger, always the first to volunteer for additional chores or responsibilities. But Elena also caught glimpses of the little girl hidden beneath all that premature adulthood, moments when Mary forgot to be vigilant and allowed herself to simply play, to laugh without checking first to make sure her siblings were safe. James was curious about everything, asking endless questions about the world beyond their cabin walls. "Why is snow white?" he would ask, pressing his nose against the window. "Where do birds go when it's cold? How deep is deep? Why don't trees have feelings?" His questions came in rapid-fire bursts that left Elena scrambling to provide answers, but she found herself delighting in his curiosity, in the way his face lit up when she explained something new. And little Sarah, though still silent, began to smile when Elena sang the lullabies her own mother had once sung to her. The child would curl up in Elena's lap during the long winter evenings, her small body gradually relaxing as Elena's voice filled the cabin with melodies that spoke of love and safety and belonging. Sarah never sang along, but Elena often caught her humming the tunes under her breath when she thought no one was listening. Elena discovered muscles she didn't know she had as she hauled water, chopped firewood, and stretched their food supplies to feed 4 instead of 1. But she also discovered reserves of patience, creativity, and love that had been lying dormant for 7 years, waiting for the right moment to emerge. She learned to make toys from scraps of fabric and wood, to tell stories that held 3 sets of attention for hours at a time, to judge the precise temperature of bathwater and the exact amount of honey needed to make bitter medicine palatable. The physical work was exhausting, But it was a different kind of exhaustion from the bone-deep weariness that had characterized her final month with Thomas. This was the tiredness that came from purposeful activity, from days filled with meaning and accomplishment. When she fell into bed each night, it was with the satisfaction of knowing that 3 small lives were better because of her efforts that day. It was during this time of adjustment and discovery that she first encountered Nuka. Elena was taking the children to identify animal tracks in the snow, a skill she had learned from her own father years ago when a shadow fell across their path. She looked up to see a man unlike any she had ever encountered. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with the weathered face of someone who had spent his entire life outdoors. His dark hair was streaked with premature silver, and his eyes held the kind of deep wisdom that came from understanding the language of the land itself. His clothing was different from anything worn by the village men, constructed from animal hides and decorated with intricate beadwork that spoke of a culture far older and more connected to the natural world than her own. "You are the woman from the cabin," he said in accented English, his voice carrying the cadence of someone who spoke multiple languages and had learned English as a careful addition to his native tongue. "Yes," Elena replied, instinctively moving the children behind her. She had heard stories about the native peoples who lived in the deeper wilderness, tales that varied wildly depending on who was telling them. Some spoke of fierce warriors who would kill without provocation. Others described peaceful hunters who preferred to avoid contact with white settlers entirely. Nuka's gaze moved from her to the 3 children, and something in his expression softened. Elena saw him take in their obviously mixed heritage, their clean but well-worn clothes, the way they clustered around her for protection while still maintaining the alert posture of children who had learned not to trust strangers. "I am Nuka," he said simply. "I helped families in need. I heard about the little ones." "They're with me now," Elena said firmly, her voice carrying more strength than she felt. "They're safe." "Yes," Nuka nodded slowly, and Elena was surprised to hear approval in his tone. "I can see that, but winter is long and supplies are hard to come by. Perhaps we can help each other." Over the following weeks, Nuka became a regular presence in their lives, appearing at their door with offerings of fresh fish and hunted game, staying to teach Elena traditional methods of food preservation that would make their supplies last longer and provide better nutrition. He showed the children how to read weather patterns in the behavior of animals and the color of clouds, how to find shelter and identify edible plants even in the depths of winter. But more than the practical assistance, Nuka brought something Elena hadn't realized she was missing: adult companionship, with someone who didn't judge her for her inability to bear children, someone who saw her worth in what she could do rather than what she had failed to accomplish. "In my culture," Nuka told her one evening as they watched the children play by the fire, "family is not only about blood. Family is about choice, about who you protect and who protects you. You have chosen these children, and they have chosen you. That makes you as much their mother as if you had carried them in your body." The words settled into Elena's heart like seeds finding fertile ground. For the first time since Thomas had left, she began to think of herself not as a woman who had failed at motherhood, but as a woman who had succeeded at it in an unexpected way. Nuka also brought stories, tales of his people that spoke of the deep connection between humans and the land they lived on, stories that emphasized courage, wisdom, and the importance of caring for those who couldn't care for themselves. The children loved these stories, gathering around him with rapt attention as he wove narratives that were part history, part moral instruction, and part pure entertainment. Elena found herself looking forward to these visits with an anticipation that surprised her. After months of isolation and self-doubt, she was rediscovering what it felt like to have conversations with someone who treated her as an equal, someone whose respect she had earned through her actions rather than her marital status or reproductive success. Can you imagine having children taken from you after months of caring for them as your own? How would you fight for the family you had chosen, especially when society says you have no right to them? Spring's arrival brought unexpected visitors to Elena's door.
Thomas stood on her threshold, flanked by two men Elena recognized as village elders. Behind them waited Sarah Whitmore, now Sarah Morrison, looking uncomfortable and very pregnant, with what was obviously her fourth child. The sight of Thomas hit Elena like a physical blow, even though months had passed since his departure. He looked prosperous and well-fed, his clothes new and his manner carrying the confidence of a man whose gamble had paid off. Sarah, by contrast, looked exhausted in the way that only women carrying children while managing active households could look, her face drawn with fatigue, her movements careful and guarded.
"Elena," Thomas said without preamble, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his decisions accepted without question. "We need to discuss the children." Elena's blood ran cold, but she kept her voice steady. Behind her, she could hear Mary shushing her siblings, instinctively recognizing the tension in the adult voices even if she couldn't understand the implications. "What about them?" "Word has reached the settlements about the orphans you've taken in," one of the elders said, his tone carrying the kind of official weight that Elena had learned to fear, particularly about the boy, James. A single woman has no business raising a male child without proper authority. Elena felt the familiar rage that had sustained her through the worst of her abandonment rising in her chest. "I have been raising him just fine," she replied, her hand moving protectively to where James was peeking around her skirts, his thumb in his mouth and his eyes wide with a kind of fear that came from having experienced adult conversations that ended with children being taken away. "That's not the point," Thomas interjected, and Elena noticed that he wouldn't quite meet her eyes. "The church has found suitable families for all pretty children, families with both fathers and mothers who can provide proper Christian upbringing." The words hit Elena with the force of a physical attack. She had known this moment might come, had feared it during the dark hours when she lay awake worrying about the future, but knowing hadn't prepared her for the reality of standing here listening to strangers discuss the fate of children who had become her heart and soul. "You can't take them," she said, and was proud that her voice didn't shake. "They belong with me." "They don't belong to anyone," the second elder said coldly, his eyes carrying the kind of moral certainty that Elena had learned to distrust. "They are orphans, wards of the territory. You were allowed to care for them temporarily, but permanent arrangements must be made through proper channels." Behind Elena, Mary began to cry. Not the kind of loud wailing of a tantrum, but the desperate, hopeless sobbing of a child who understood exactly what was being discussed. Little Sarah pressed herself against Elena's legs, while James looked up at her with confused, frightened eyes that asked her to make the bad people go away. "Please," Elena whispered, and hated herself for the weakness she heard in her own voice. "They're happy here. They're healthy and cared for and loved." Thomas's expression softened slightly, and for a moment Elena thought she saw a flash of the man she had once married. But his resolve remained firm, and when he spoke, his voice carried the patience of someone explaining something obvious to a slow child. "Elena, you can't give them what they need. You can't give them fathers, and you can't give them the kind of stability that comes from a traditional family structure. It's time to stop living in fantasy." It was then that Nunaka appeared in the doorway behind the group of men. Elena had not seen him approach, a skill he possessed that never failed to amaze her. But there he was, tall and imposing in his traditional clothing, carrying himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being respected. "There seems to be a misunderstanding," Nuka said calmly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. Thomas turned, clearly annoyed by the interruption. His lip curled slightly as he took in Nuka's appearance, the native clothing, the silver-streaked hair, the quiet confidence that needed no validation from white society. "This doesn't concern you, Indian." Elena saw the flash of anger in Nuka's eyes, but his voice remained level. "These children are under my protection, as is Elena, and in my culture, that makes this very much my concern. What happened next would be talked about in the village for years to come." Nuka stepped forward and, with the formal bearing of someone making an official declaration, placed his hand on Elena's shoulder, a gesture that in his culture signified both protection and endorsement. Elena Morrison has proven herself worthy of motherhood in ways that cannot be measured by traditional means. She chose love over abandonment,
sacrifice over selfishness, and courage over fear. The Great Spirit has blessed her with children in the way he saw fit. He turned to address the children directly, switching to a mixture of English and his native tongue that made his words sound like a formal ceremony. "Mary, James, Sarah, do you wish to stay with Elena?" "Yes," Mary cried out immediately, her voice fierce with the kind of loyalty that could not be manufactured or coerced. "She's our mama now." James nodded vigorously, pulling his thumb from his mouth long enough to add, "Mama Elena feeds us and tells stories and doesn't hit us ever." And then, in a moment that would remain etched in Elena's memory for the rest of her life, little Sarah, who had been silent for months, spoke her first word since arriving at Elena's door. "Mama Elena." The words were soft, barely audible, but they carried the weight of a child's complete trust and love. Elena's eyes filled with tears as she heard the tiny voice, realizing that Sarah had chosen to break her silence not for food, warmth, or safety, but to claim Elena as her mother in front of these men who wanted to take her away. Nuka looked back at Thomas and the elders, his expression serene but implacable. "These children have chosen their family. In the eyes of my people, that choice carries more weight than any law written by distant governments." "Your people have no authority here," one of the elders began, his voice rising with the kind of outrage that came from having his assumptions challenged by someone he considered inferior. But Nuka held up his hand, and something in his manner, the absolute stillness of his body, the unwavering directness of his gaze, made the man fall silent.
"My people have lived on this land for thousands of years," Nuka said quietly. "We understand what makes a family strong." He gestured towards Alenga and the three children clustered around her, their arms wrapped around each other in a circle of mutual protection. "Look at them. Look at how they protect each other, how they have grown together. This is what family looks like." Thomas stared at the scene before him, his former wife surrounded by children who clearly adored her, defended by a man who saw her worth in ways Thomas never had. Elena watched his face, seeing the calculations running behind his eyes as he weighed the cost of a prolonged legal battle against the convenience of having the children cared for by someone else. For the first time since he'd ridden away months earlier, doubt flickered across Thomas's features. He looked at Sarah, his new wife, whose pregnancy was well advanced and whose exhaustion was written in every line of her body. Adding 3 more children to their already complicated household would strain resources that were already stretched thin. "The law," the first elder started again, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. "The law can be flexible when it serves the best interests of children," Nuka interrupted, his tone suggesting that he knew more about territorial regulations than the elders had assumed, especially when those children are clearly thriving under current arrangements. Sarah Morrison stepped forward from behind the group of men, one hand pressed to the small of her back in the universal gesture of pregnant women everywhere. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the practical wisdom of someone who understood exactly what caring for children actually involved. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "it would be better to let sleeping dogs lie. The children seem content." Thomas looked at his new wife, then back at Elena and the orphans. Elena could see him calculating, weighing the cost of a legal battle against the convenience of having the children cared for by someone else, measuring the potential complications against the simplicity of leaving well enough alone. His new family was already complicated enough without adding 3 more children to the mix, especially children who had made their preferences so dramatically clear. The silence stretched between them, filled with possibilities and calculations, and the kind of adult compromises that children never fully understand. Elena held her breath, her arms tightening around the 3 small bodies pressed against her, waiting for a decision that would determine whether her heart would be broken again, or whether she would be allowed to keep the family she had found in the most unexpected way. Finally, Thomas nodded slowly. "Perhaps you're right," he said to Sarah, his voice carrying the relief of someone who had found a way to step back from a confrontation he wasn't sure he could win. "The children do seem settled." One of the elders started to protest, but Thomas cut him off with a gesture. The church can find other orphans to place with appropriate families. These 3 are clearly being cared for adequately. Elena felt her knees go weak with relief, but she managed to keep her voice steady as she said, "Thank you." Thomas nodded curtly, already turning away. As the group prepared to leave, he paused and looked back at her one last time. "Take care of yourself, Elena," he said. And for just a moment, she heard an echo of genuine concern in his voice. After they were gone, Elena sank down onto her front step, pulling all 3 children into her arms. They clung to each other in a tangle of relief and residual fear, and Elena found herself crying. Not tears of sadness this time, but tears of gratitude and overwhelming love. "Are they really gone?" Mary whispered against Elena's shoulder. "They won't come back?" "They're really gone," Elena assured her. "You're staying with me, all of you, for as long as you want." Nuka settled beside them on the step, his presence solid and reassuring. "Family is not about papers or laws," he said quietly. "Family is about hearts that choose to beat together." 6 months later, Elena stood in the same spot where she had once watched Thomas ride away. But this time she was not alone. Mary held her hand on one side while James clung to her other arm, chattering excitedly about the rabbit tracks they had found near the creek. Little Sarah sat on Nuka's shoulders, her formerly silent tongue now liberated and chattering in the mix of English and Inuktitut that had become her preferred language. The village had slowly accepted the unusual family arrangement, helped in no small part by Nuka's quiet authority and the undeniable evidence that the children were thriving under Elena's care. More importantly, Elena had stopped caring what the village thought. She had learned that families could be born in the heart just as surely as they could be born in the body, and sometimes the children who chose you were exactly the ones you were meant to raise all along. Mary had become Elena's right hand, helping with household tasks while excelling in the lessons Nuka taught about surviving in the Arctic wilderness. Her natural leadership abilities had found their proper outlet in helping to care for her siblings, and Elena often marveled at the girl's intuitive understanding of what each child needed at any given moment. The grave responsibility that had once seemed like a burden was now simply part of who Mary was, a natural caretaker who would someday make an extraordinary mother herself. James had developed into a confident, curious boy who asked a million questions and never met a stranger. His early wariness had given way to an open, trusting nature that delighted everyone who met him. He followed Nuka around like a shadow when the man was visiting, absorbing lessons about hunting, tracking, and reading the natural world with the eager attention of someone who had found his calling. And Sarah had blossomed from a silent, traumatized child into a chatty little girl who called Elena Mama and Nuka Papa with equal affection. Her bilingual chatter filled the cabin with music, and Elena often found herself simply listening to the child's voice with wonder, remembering the months when silence had been Sarah's only language. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. There had been nights when James woke screaming from nightmares about his dead parents, days when Mary's protective instincts became overbearing to her siblings, moments when Sarah retreated into silence whenever strangers visited. But Elena had learned to navigate these difficulties with patience and intuition, guided by Nuka's wisdom and her own growing confidence as a mother. "The supply wagon will arrive tomorrow," Nuka told Elena as they watched the children play in the snow, building an elaborate fort that would probably be destroyed by the next storm, but was providing hours of entertainment in its construction. "Winter preparations begin soon." Elena nodded, mentally calculating the supplies they would need for a family of 5. It still amazed her sometimes how quickly she had gone from a woman with nothing to a woman with everything that mattered. The pantry that had once held enough food for 2 people now groaned under the weight of provisions for 5. And she had learned to plan meals with the efficiency of a quartermaster managing supplies for a small army. "Do you ever regret it?" Nuka asked quietly, his voice pitched low enough that the children couldn't hear. "The path that brought you here." Elena considered the question seriously as she considered all of Nuka's questions. 7 years of trying to have children with Thomas had ended in disappointment and abandonment. But those 7 years had also prepared her for the moment when 3 orphan children needed someone to choose love over convenience. Every monthly disappointment, every doctor's visit that yielded no answers, Every night she had lain awake wondering what was wrong with her. All of it had led to this moment, to this family that fit together like pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving. "No," she said finally, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had found her true calling. Every disappointment, every lonely night, every cruel word, it all led me to them and to you. Nuka smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face into something unexpectedly gentle. "The children of the heart are no less precious than the children of the body," he said, repeating words that had become a kind of family motto in their household. "Sometimes they are more so, because they are chosen with full knowledge of what the choice will cost." As if summoned by their conversation, the three children came running through the snow, faces flushed with cold and excitement. Their fort had apparently been abandoned in favor of some new adventure that required immediate adult attention.
"Mama Elena, Papa Nuka," Mary called out, using the titles that had evolved naturally over the months without any formal discussion or ceremony. "Come see what we built. James made a snow animal that looks just like the rabbits we've been tracking." Elena looked at her family, chosen, not born, assembled by chance and held together by love, and felt a completeness she had never experienced during all those years of trying to conceive. The village women no longer whispered about the barren woman who couldn't give her husband children. Instead, they spoke in admiring tones about Elena Morrison, the woman who had opened her heart and home to 3 orphans and created a family that was stronger than many built on traditional foundations. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on her. She had been called barren, abandoned for her inability to bear children, written off as a woman who had failed at her most basic function. But she had ended up with more children than most women in the village, children who loved her with the fierce devotion that came from gratitude mixed with genuine affection. She had become exactly what those cruel whispers claimed she never could be: a mother. Thomas still lived in the settlement with Sarah and their growing family. Sometimes Elena saw him at the trading post when she went to purchase supplies, and they would nod politely to each other like distant acquaintances. She felt no bitterness toward him anymore, no anger at the man who had abandoned her when she needed him most. His departure had been cruel, but it had also been necessary. It had freed her to become the woman and mother she was always meant to be. Sarah had given birth to a healthy son just 2 months after the confrontation at Elena's cabin, bringing Thomas's total number of children to 4. Elena had heard through village gossip that Sarah was already pregnant again, and she felt a brief moment of sympathy for the woman who had inherited Elena's former life. The constant cycle of pregnancy and childbirth that had once seemed like the ultimate blessing now struck Elena as exhausting in a way that raising her 3 chosen children never was. The children had settled into rhythms that felt as natural as breathing. Mary took her role as big sister seriously, organizing games and settling disputes with the natural authority of someone born to lead. James continued his endless exploration of the world around them, bringing home interesting rocks, unusual feathers, and endless questions about everything from why snow melted to where the sun went at night. And Sarah had become the family entertainer, her formerly silent tongue now producing an endless stream of songs, stories, and observations that kept them all laughing. Winter preparations had become a family affair, with even the youngest children contributing to the work of gathering wood, preserving food, and preparing the cabin for the long months of cold ahead. Elena watched her children work alongside Nuka, learning skills that would serve them well throughout their lives, and felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that they were growing up self-reliant and capable. The relationship with Nuka had evolved slowly, naturally, without the dramatic declarations or formal ceremonies that had characterized her marriage to Thomas. They had simply grown closer through shared responsibilities and mutual respect, until Elena realized one day that she couldn't imagine her life without him. He had never asked her to marry him in the traditional sense. Such formal arrangements meant little in his culture.
but their commitment to each other and to the children was absolute. The children adored Nuka with the uncomplicated love that came from being valued and protected. He taught them skills their white father figures never could have: how to read animal behavior, how to find water in seemingly barren landscapes, how to understand weather patterns and seasonal changes. But more than that, he taught them to see themselves as part of something larger, connected to the land and the natural world in ways that gave their lives deeper meaning. Elena had learned more about herself in the past year than she had in the previous 7. She discovered that she was stronger than she had ever imagined, more resourceful than she had given herself credit for, and more capable of love than she had dared to hope. The woman who had once defined herself entirely by her failures as a wife had become someone who measured success by very different standards. The cabin that had once echoed with emptiness now rang with the sounds of a vibrant family. The nursery that had stood as a monument to her reproductive failures had been transformed into bedrooms where children dreamed safely each night. The kitchen that had once prepared meals for 2 now bustled with the organized chaos of feeding 5 people with very different appetites and preferences. But perhaps most importantly, Elena had learned that motherhood wasn't about biology. It was about choice, commitment, and the daily decision to put children's needs before your own comfort. She had become a mother not through the mechanics of conception and birth, but through the much more difficult process of opening her heart to children who needed her and allowing them to transform her life completely. The approaching winter no longer seemed like a season to be endured, but rather like an opportunity for the family to draw closer together, to share stories around the fire, and create memories that would last long after the children were grown and gone. Elena found herself looking forward to the long evenings of storytelling, the projects they would work on together, the quiet moments of connection that cold weather encouraged. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, Elena called the children inside for their evening meal.
They came reluctantly, as children always do when called away from play, but they came quickly because they knew that dinner meant family time, conversation, and the comfortable rituals that made a house feel like home. Around their table, expanded with boards and sawhorses to accommodate 5 people instead of the original 2, Elena looked at each face illuminated by candlelight and felt a gratitude so profound it took her breath away. Mary, serious and responsible, even while giggling at one of James's silly faces. James, animated and curious, already planning tomorrow's adventures. Little Sarah, chattering happily about everything and nothing, secure in the knowledge that she was loved and wanted. And Nuka, solid and dependable, watching over them all with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had found his purpose. This was her family. Not the family she had planned, not the family society had told her she should want, but the family that had chosen her, just as surely as she had chosen them. They were bound together not by blood or law or social convention, but by something much stronger, by love freely given and gratefully received, by shared experiences and mutual commitment, by the simple daily choice to remain together through whatever challenges life might bring. The Arctic wind howled around their cabin, but inside all was warmth and light and laughter. Elena Morrison, the woman they had once called barren, sat surrounded by more children than anyone in the Arctic village, exactly as the story had promised from its very beginning. She had learned that families could be born in the heart just as surely as they could be born in the body, and sometimes the children who chose you were exactly the ones you were meant to raise all along. As she tucked each child into bed that night, Elena reflected on the strange turns life could take. She had been called barren, abandoned, forgotten, but she had also been chosen, needed, and loved in ways she had never imagined possible. The path to motherhood had not been what she expected, but it had led her exactly where she belonged. To a cabin filled with children's voices, to a life defined by purpose rather than failure, to a love that had grown from the most unlikely circumstances into something beautiful and lasting. Nobody had imagined that the woman they called barren would become the mother to more children than anyone in the Arctic village. But Elena Morrison had proven that motherhood wasn't about what your body could create. It was about what your heart could hold. And her heart, it turned out,
had room for an entire world of love.